And of course, as always, we're going to collect your questions throughout today's discussion. I'm going to try to work in as many of them as I can. So if you have any questions, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Again, I'll be sort of keeping track of those as we go along. So now to introduce our esteemed panelists. Jamelle Bouie is a columnist for the New York Times and a political analyst for CBS News. Prior to the Times, he was chief political correspondent at Slate Magazine, and before that, he was staff writer at the Daily Beast and held fellowships at the American Prospect and The Nation magazine. And Juan Williams is a prize-winning journalist and historian. He's the author of best-selling books like Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years 1954 to 1965, which accompanied the landmark PBS series of the same name. He also wrote a landmark biography of Thurgood Marshall, American revolutionary, as well as the New York Times bestsellers Enough and Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate. He's joining us today to discuss his newest book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. Thank you for joining us, Jamelle Bouie and Juan Williams.
Good to be with you,
Thank you for
Tom.
having us.
Yeah.
And so, Juan, I'll start with you. You know, your book covers what you call the second civil rights movement. Maybe just to help provide us with an overview and a definition to make sure we're all on the same page. You know, what do you mean by the second civil rights movement?
Well, Tom, I think that we as a nation, the USA, is going through a second civil rights movement, and it's having an impact that rivals the impact of the first, the classically defined first civil rights movement, 1954 to 1965. The subtitle of a book I wrote back in the late 80s was Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years 1954 to 1965, which would go from the Brown decision through the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Today, my argument in this book, New Prize for These Eyes, is that we are going through a second movement that has a different agenda. But if you stop and think about it, its impact, its power may actually be greater. I note that in the kind of highlight of the first movement was the Great March on Washington led by Dr. King. And it was in Washington, 250,000 people for one day. You think about what happened after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and you had thousands of marches across the country, even across the globe. I mean, you could have been in Paris, you could have been in London, you could have been in Buenos Aires and marching under the Black Lives Matter banner. And not only that, it's 24/7 because so much of it is online, people coming to it, coming to each other, organizing online. So it is a constant conversation, the tweets, the memes, the messaging, and it's ongoing. And to me, this is the power of the second civil rights movement. And, you know, I must say, as I'm going around talking about this book, that people say, you know, I haven't quite put it together. But I think it's important that people see that they're living through real American history at this moment in terms of a fight over so much to do with race. And it's become even more obvious, I think, because of President Trump and his attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, and trying to diminish that fight is part of this second movement. You know, in some ways you could say if there are two powerful forces at play in this moment, one would be the continuing power of the second movement in Black Lives Matter. The other would be the backlash. And the backlash would be Make America Great Again, Trump, and kind of grievance aimed at the success of Black Lives Matter.
Thank you so much for that framing, Juan. I mean, Jamelle, we'll obviously drill down into some of the details of Juan's book and the second civil rights movement, but maybe just begin with the broad question of, do you agree with Juan that we're currently going through a second civil rights movement? And, you know, how would you know, if so, how would you describe it and how would you characterize its impact?
Yeah, I think it's fair to describe sort of the Black Lives Matter era as a second civil rights movement. This kind of periodization is always sort of interesting to try to do, right? Like historians will have like begun to push the first civil rights movement back from the 50s to the 40s to the 30s, right? Like there's this question of like when does something begin and when does something end is always interesting. But I would say that the Black Lives Matter era you can describe as a second civil rights movement, and I'd say that its substance its substance is something akin to trying to realize maybe the more substantive visions, excuse me, of the first civil rights movement. As a quick parenthetical, we're discussing our conversation before this started, and you said, Thomas, I'm going to ask you some questions about the first civil rights movement, and because of the way my mind works, I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about the 19th century.
Yes, mine too, Jamelle. So yes, I hear that,
I
totally.
was like, oh, we'll talk about, like the 1830s and 40s, which is there's a whole effort to realize civil rights for Black Americans during that period too. But that's an aside. I was just like, oh, that's not the other first civil rights movement. But the more substantive vision of that civil rights movement you can see in, for example, the name of the March on Washington, which was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, in that this movement was both a push for inclusion, equal inclusion in American life, but also um, a more substantive economic and social equality. Not simply, oh, we can apply for the same jobs, but also we can thrive in American society. We have access to the same kinds of benefits. And King and others envision a sort of a more expansive social democratic state that would enable and facilitate integration and inclusion, these sorts of things. And I think in the with the second civil rights movement, what you see there is kind of that a desire for that, right? I don't think it's an accident that it emerges during Barack Obama's presidency. In Barack Obama's presidency, you see sort of the conclusion almost of the success of kind of formal equality and formal inclusion.
Mhm.
But with the Black president, you also see sort of the limits of that in a very dramatic way. Uh, and I think the Black Lives Matter and everything it's followed is very much a reaction itself to the limits of that kind of formal inclusion, formal equality without a more substantive base.
No, I think
I always want to pick up, Tom, on something that Jamelle was talking about, which is obviously Reconstruction and the 1800s. That could be seen as a first movement. But the way that I define, in my life, Jamel's younger than me, but in my life, when I was a kid, it was the first movement was that tremendous movement. And I define it in historical terms as being about the end of legal segregation. Obviously, that's what took place in Brown v. Board. And then trying to get the Congress, the point of the Great March on Washington was to get the Congress, the president, to support the passage of a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act. So Jamelle makes a key point about, the fruit of that first movement is not just the passage of those pieces of legislation, but in some ways, it's the growth of Black political power. That the idea was that you would have Black politicians who would do a good job of representing Black people and their humanity and their political rights and protecting those rights. And so those Black politicians would rise up in power and empower Black people as a result. Two quick points here. One is obviously, here we are early in the 21st century. America is a very different place. Used to be 90% white during the period of that 54 to 65. Now it's about 60+% white. Black people no longer the second largest minority. Now it's Latinos, and Asians the fastest growing minority. But when Jamelle was talking about hard to define when things start and end periods in history, so I'm trying my best as I frame New Prize for These Eyes. I said, I think part of the growth out of the first movement was the fact that here you have this young Black man from Illinois, a state senator in 2004, giving a speech to the Democratic National Convention. So he's a politician and he's on the national stage. And he says, in amazing terms that I think are almost in everyone's mind. We don't live in a Black America. We don't live in a white America. We don't live in a Latino and Asian America. We live in the United States of America. And it opens the door to conversations about a post-racial period in American life. And it's very optimistic. I was in the room and I was near Jesse Jackson. People used to Jackson. Sharpton was coming into his own at that period. But what you saw there was a young man talking about America in positive terms, not about the debts owed to Black people given slavery, legal discrimination, and the like. But here he was saying, my story wouldn't be possible in any other country but the USA. And people were like, whoa, this is an new horizons. And of course, he goes on to run for president, and his poster is hope. It's a different view. And I think so Jamelle picks up on this and says some of the reality of the second civil rights movement is people seeing a Black man in the most powerful political post in America and yet feeling, you know what, schools in my neighborhood haven't gotten better. My job opportunities haven't improved. I still see violence in my neighborhood. Have the Black politicians delivered for me? And raising these questions about mass incarceration and the like. And to me, that too is an essential part of understanding a different generation and a second movement.
I think that's great. And that places a lot on the table substantively about sort of the relationship between the first civil rights movement and the second civil rights movement. I want to drill down even more into that in a little bit, including President Obama's role in this broader story. I mean, the other, there are a few big contrasts that you make in your book, Juan. Another one is sort of an organizational slash hierarchical contrast between the first civil rights movement and the second civil rights movement. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of what the institutional structure and what some of the key organizations were in that first movement and sort of how it compares to what we see once we get to the second?
Well, so one of the delights about having Jamelle here today is I feel almost like a generational conversation, right? Because I'm an old man, I'm 70 years old, and and I'm just anxious to hear what he has to say on this point. But in the book, I make the case, Tom, that in the first movement, so much depended on tapes coming back from the South from civil rights clashes, making it to New York, to big networks, to big newspapers like the New York Times. Would they cover? And, for much of American history, the big papers and the big networks, as the networks came into being, even the radio, didn't cover racial discrimination, racial bias, violence against people who were asking for equal rights. And then you get the whole argument about, well, are we being covered fairly, etc. That's first movement. Here comes second movement, Tom. It's the internet, as we were touching on earlier. And in that internet reality, the constant conversation, but it also opens the door to a different kind of organizing. First movement with the big white newspapers, especially, putting aside the reality of Black newspapers for a moment. When you look at those people, they are saying, well, we have NAACP, Urban League, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, much of it leadership housed in New York or Atlanta. And they have a clear set of leaders. You're thinking about people like Whitney Young, Dr. King, obviously people like John Lewis. I could go on, and then you have coming forward from that a clear agenda because they've put out messages or they respond to news events again through that media. But in the second movement that I'm depicting in the book, now you have people who are online and having conversations, and it's not clear who's the leadership, even though there was very clear. You had people like, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, and others who created the idea of Black Lives Matter after Trayvon Martin's murderer was acquitted, saying that young man's life mattered. They really didn't want to replicate the kind of hierarchical, male-dominated patriarchy of the first movement, and even to the point of agenda. Their agenda, they said, if you live in Cleveland, if you live in San Diego, you know the civil rights reality on the ground. You create your own Black Lives Matter agenda. Now, that agenda broadly, we could discuss. I mean, things like mass incarceration, the police brutality, the George Floyd case, the Trayvon Martin case, and others. We could talk about bad schools, anything, but you see, it's more dispersed and it's not as clear, I think, in terms of the message coming through to the mass of news consumers in America. So again, no hierarchical movement and a more diverse or dispersed political agenda.
That's a great way of framing it. So, I mean, Jamelle, Juan's placed on the table here, some ways of comparing and contrasting the organization of the first civil rights movement, second civil rights movement. It's also placed on the table some key figures in both movements and compared and contrasted them a bit. I'd love your thoughts on some of these organizational differences, maybe even some of the observations Juan made about the role of technology in each movement. And even going back to things that I think you write so powerfully on, if there are particular figures you'd want to highlight in either movement for us to think about it as major figures of influence. For instance, you've written powerfully about Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph in the first civil rights movement. I'd love for you to place those on the table as well.
Sure. I mean, the thing that immediately strikes me, and I think Juan makes it. I think it's correct to observe that the first civil rights movement is like much more hierarchical, and the second is much more diffuse and amorphous in a lot of ways. I think some of that reflects sort of the overall the environment in which they are operating. The second civil rights movement is operating in a world where there is at least sort of like a surface level commitment to formal racial equality, where there is for the most part people there's some amount of like fair opportunity for like many people, not all people but many people, right? It's not it's a world where making making claims about the existence of racism, um you're making claims about sort of like structural racism. You're making claims about things that are a little harder to see directly as opposed to Jim Crow, but also the this sort of the targets, right? Police brutality, for example. Um, uh, there's no central police agency, right? Sort of it's lots of police departments, it's lots of law enforcement organizations across the entire country, and it's being sparked by discrete events in different places in the country. So first of all, like the non-hierarchical nature is just like probably a reflection of what is actually driving the activity, but also it seems that the goal, the end in mind, is a little more of a desire for like a cultural shift,
Mm.
something that would push the nation to sort of culturally take seriously the existence of like legacies of racism and so on and so forth. That's very distinct from the first civil rights movement, and I'm thinking of a great book, Waging a Good War, a military history of the civil rights movement by Tom Ricks. That first civil rights movement is very much organized like a disciplined campaign against a like discrete and well-defined opponent, right? It's like the Jim Crow system is something very concrete, easy to perceive, with its own legible logic. In that movement, its organizations, its hierarchical structure, it's very much structured around how do we confront that in a way that will bring the kind of pressure that will undermine it and allow us to kind of wield federal power against it. And in that way, the first civil rights movement, as Ricks argues, is a lot like a military campaign and sort of operates according to the principles of a military campaign. The strategist of that movement, Bayard Rustin, for example, are thinking about where to stage demonstrations, where to try to generate media attention in a way not unlike a general deciding where to stage an engagement um, for maximum uh, for maximum advantage and gain. So I mean, that's sort of how I see the difference there. That it's two sort of different goals in mind. And in the case of the second civil rights movement, in the case of the past 10 to 15 years, it's something much much broader than simply trying to like take down the government of Mississippi, right? Like it's something a little more amorphous, frankly. It's like if you can successfully persuade a lot of people that there is something called structural racial discrimination, and to the credit of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, successfully persuaded many Americans that there is something um, called structural racial discrimination. It's like, okay, you've done that. Then it's sort of like, well, what's next?
Mhm.
What's the kind of concrete action you have to take? And that one of the downsides of the more horizontal organization, you might say, of the second civil rights movement is that having won a cultural victory, it was hard to consolidate that into like a durable political one.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great way of framing it, Jamel. And I mean, I think it does give us a good sense of sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the, at least as initial matter, the approaches of the first and second civil rights movement. One, as you said, one interesting feature of this conversation is it's an intergenerational conversation about the long civil rights movement. And certainly one of the themes you've already drawn out and certainly comes out in your book is some of the intergenerational tensions within the Black community during the second civil rights movement. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about that and the role that that's played in how the second civil rights movement has unfolded.
Sure, Tom. So, I agree with what Jamel was just saying in terms of describing, with the Rick's book and others,
Mhm.
how this first movement was so strategically thought out and planned. The way I think of it, by the way, is almost in terms of pictures. You think back to that first movement and marches, and most often you saw people dressed in their Sunday best, suits, ties, coats, and hats. And I think very intentionally to suggest Black people as educated, thoughtful, caring, that this was not going to be seen as people who were not organized and not fully American and not fully respectful of each other or the society. And that was all part of the Dr. King and I think the church base of that movement, if you will. Now you come forward in time, and I think part of that movement, as I've said to you before, is the growth, the explosion of Black political power in terms of Black people holding elected office, the cherry obviously being President Obama's election twice as President of the United States. But then what you see is the older generation, and here I would put myself in this category, maybe expressed best by the cover of Ebony magazine. I think it was in '08, could have been '09, Tom. It said, "In my lifetime." Oh my God, in my lifetime, there's a Black man as president of the United States in the White House holding the bully pulpit. And I never thought I would see that, didn't think it was possible. And in so many ways, it was fulfilling. And then to see younger people, younger Black people say, okay, so what comes of this? What's the payoff? You guys were fighting for this, but so now is it the case that when Trayvon Martin is killed, that you're going to see the Black president act in some very distinctive way as the Black president? Of course, Obama was saying he's not the Black president, he's the president of all people, he's the president of the United States. And when Trayvon Martin is killed and Obama is asked about it, he says, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And the response from the white community especially was, why are you making this a racial issue? It's a local issue. Obviously, people have differences of opinion, but now you introduced race into it as if, but from the black perspective, especially from younger black people, it was, why aren't you more effective in responding to this outrage? And why aren't you saying more about it? And I think we saw that also then subsequently when Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, had a confrontation with a policeman. He'd come back, he couldn't get in his house, and had left the key or something. And then the police come and he ends up being arrested. And Obama's asked about it and says, the Cambridge police behaved stupidly. And people are like, the white American response is, why is he getting involved? Why is he raising race as an issue? But you see, by the way, just very quickly, his approval numbers among white Americans never again exceeds 50%. It had a very daunting, difficult impact on Obama's standing. But Black America, and I think this is really important to grasp, especially among leadership people like Black Lives Matter, some of them were just frustrated with Obama. Why isn't it's not only that the question was, why isn't he doing more? They wanted to know why a lot of these Black people in Congress and City Hall hadn't made the big difference that the first generation thought was coming with more Black elected officials. And for Obama, I think the idea that some of these leaders wouldn't even meet with him. Now you stop and think about this. They wouldn't, they had such a distaste for politics and politicians of all colors, including Black ones, that they say, what, I'm not talking to that guy. It'll become a PR event for the White House and for Obama. The first generation just wouldn't have seen it that way, and still love Obama to this moment. So I think there is a generational divide there.
That's great, Juan. And Jamelle, you sort of connecting to Juan's reflections here on President Obama and some of the reactions within the Black community during his presidency. You certainly, throughout that period, wrote powerfully on the various episodes violence that we saw during this period. Trayvon Martin, the Henry Louis Gates incident that Juan talked about here. I mean, if you were thinking more broadly, where do you see President Obama fitting into this second civil rights story, and how do you think about how he negotiated the issue of race during his presidency? And just connecting back to your previous response, Jamelle, I think you so powerfully encapsulated the mission statement of the first civil rights movement is, going after a big enemy that was Jim Crow, and then, contrasting it with the second civil rights movement in a more dispersed agenda. If you could talk a little bit more about the agenda of the second civil rights movement, what sort of issues are have been pushed by it, and your sense of whether or not you think it was kind of inevitable that second civil rights movement would be more dispersed, or whether there would have been a way to crystallize it into sort of a broader and maybe more structured movement like the first civil rights movement.
Yeah. I think one way of getting at this question is to just think about the overall political economy of, say, the 1950s and 60s and the 2000s, well, in the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s. In the former, in the 50s and 60s, the American economy is still one based on this sort of notion of, each household has a primary earner. That earns a wage that's like, high enough to support a family. There's robust government support for housing, at least for some Americans, not all Americans, of course. It's an overall, and in terms of global competition, the United States is still sort of the preeminent nation because there just still really isn't much competition in terms of the production of consumer goods and all these other things. And so it's sort of like in that environment, it's like part of what is on the table for the civil rights movement is an attempt to be part of the bounty, right? There's this great bounty in American society, but Black Americans are excluded from it. They're excluded from political participation in much of the country, and they're also excluded from this great economic bounty. And so part of the goal is to win inclusion into that as much as anything. But as we jump forward a generation or two, And it's a very different kind of political economy. It's one where the nation has transitioned to an economy where a service-based economy, an economy where so much of economic growth is being driven by, um, uh, the financial industry, by finance, where wages are generally stagnant, and so on and so forth, where there's a growing and high levels of inequality. And so in that world, enter Barack Obama. And Obama, who's running during the recession, at the time of the Great Recession, another example of kind of like the very different political economy of the era. Obama is this great symbolic victory, but he's still operating according to the logic of the political economy of the era. He's not like a neo New Dealer, right? Like he is someone who does generally buy in to the basic assumptions about the a modest role for government, but not like an overweening one, like a commitment to sort of the American economy as it exists, not like a transformative vision. And so there's almost this irony that's happening where you have this figure who, and in some ways, is this culmination of some of the aspirations of the first civil rights movement in terms of representation in the society, but who, by virtue of what the U.S. is structurally at the time, by the virtue of his kind of structural position, he is the leader of a major political party, which generally isn't the kind of position from which you are affecting massive transformation of the entire country. Um, uh, he uh, is there are like real limits as to the kinds of things he can do, and then additional limits imposed by the fact that although he is the first black president, as Juan kind of suggested earlier, he can't really be the president of Black America. That's almost like the bargain, right? Like, um, I don't know how people may feel about this, but I sort of think I don't sort of think I do think that a black politician who was a descendant of American enslaved people may not have been able to become president at that moment. And the fact that Barack Obama is mixed race and his father is from Africa, I think actually kind of made his rise a bit more viable, precisely because he's not connected to this notion of an American original sin, right? He doesn't have the kind of direct ancestral connection to it. He's been acculturated into Black America by virtue of his wife, by virtue of his decision to live in Chicago, like all those things. But if Obama had sounded like Jesse Jackson, I don't think he would be president. Um, and that puts real hard limits on his ability to like act as a representative of Black America, as seen right in the fact that these two instances, the Skip Gates incident and then his remarks after Trayvon Martin's killing, end up, I see those things and they're totally innocuous to me, right? Like him telling the cop, yeah, he kind of acted stupidly by arresting this Harvard professor getting into his home, and then him saying, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. These things seem completely inoffensive to me, but to many Americans, they were read as almost a betrayal. And I actually think it's worth going back and looking at the reaction to those things. They were treated as a betrayal. And I think they were treated as a betrayal because they seemed to be Obama saying, in effect, yeah, I am black in the way that you maybe are uncomfortable with, right? I'm not simply superficially black or, aesthetically black, but like I live my life as a black man in a way that you might be uncomfortable with. Um, that reality puts limits on his ability to or the reality of that kind of backlash, that kind of reaction, puts limits on his ability to act as like a president for Black America. It kind of, I think, forces him to constantly reiterate and constantly remind but Black Americans and Americans at large, that he considers himself president of the entire United States of America. And it puts into even more, I think, even more stark relief the kind of limits of representation at that level, that it is a nice thing to have a Black American president, but a Black American president isn't necessarily going to be able to alleviate the years of disinvestment in American inner cities. It's not necessarily going to be able to to unilaterally reduce the kinds of income inequality that have really hit Black American families hardest, and so on and so forth. Um, and so Obama, I mean, for me, Obama is this interesting figure in that he is both like the apex of representational politics, but also this transition figure away from representational politics. Um, uh, because you don't you sort of don't know you don't know what is you don't know the limits of something until you've actually experienced it, and it's there's probably a book to be written about like the cultural history of the Black president. Like there are all these there are all these visions of what a Black presidency might be in American pop culture, and then we finally have one, and it's almost kind of mundane, and then it's like, well, what next?
Well, what I was thinking as you were speaking, Jamel, is that when Obama comes in office, as you point out, that we have the recession really gripping the American political narrative as well as the American political economy. And the question is, what's he going to do? And then the argument is he bails out Wall Street, too big to fail and the like. But then the contrary argument is he doesn't bail out Main Street. And what about middle income, poor Black people? Is there any special effort for them? Answer no. And then he goes on, sticking to again, the economic outline Jamel made. In my mind, he goes on, and his next step is his major legislative effort in terms of the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. And what does that generate? A Tea Party backlash, overwhelmingly white. And part of this conversation is that Obama didn't win the majority of white voters, but he won enough to win with an overwhelming support coming from minority, Black, Latino, Asian voters. But suddenly there's a backlash of a Republican Party that is overwhelmingly white, more than 80% to this day. And they're saying with Obamacare, oh, you're going to take away my health insurance? You're going to disrupt the way that I get health insurance so that you can give health insurance to middle income, working class, and poor, disproportionately people of color. And we see you as, in that moment, the Black president. And we see you as not the president of the United States. Now, in New Prize for These Eyes, I say the kind of conversation I'm having here with you guys makes Obama, to me, the most misunderstood president ever. I mean, people, I don't think, impose the kind of frame we're offering today in trying to understand how the American people experienced Obama. So it caught my ear when I heard Jamel said, maybe it's because he was of mixed race and didn't have that kind of background tied to the ancestral burden of original sin slavery, that he was acceptable to enough white people to win the presidency. I think that's exactly right. But I also would argue that when he speaks in hopeful, optimistic terms, it does for lots of people who aren't locked in to the argument that had been coming from the Jesse Jacksons and the like. It's almost like they say, wow, well, maybe we can get out of that rut and have a different kind of conversation about race in America, only then to see that when he is actually president, we're back in that rut in some ways. And it's not only in terms of the Affordable Care Act, but of course, then the emergence of people like Donald Trump saying he wasn't even born in America. He's not a real Black American. He's not even a real American. and he's illegitimate and shouldn't be in the White House. I mean, a tremendous assault, insult that Obama, at least to my surprise, actually responds to by producing his birth certificate from Hawaii. To me, again, this is all part of a very central aspect of the Obama presidency as it comes to define the backlash and opposition to the second civil rights movement.
I think it's great. And Juan, I mean, we've spent a lot of time on President Obama, and rightly so, as a key figure in the second civil rights movement. I think the other most visible part of the second civil rights movement or actors is Black Lives Matter, who we've brought up a few different times in our conversation. But it didn't give us just a little sort of a brief history of Black Lives Matter, sort of how it arose, and then talk a little bit about the relationship between Black Lives Matter, the organization, the movement, and the hashtag, and kind of how that plays into the story of the second civil rights movement.
Well, I must tell you, so many people, interacting with me around this book don't have a clear sense of Black Lives Matter. A lot of people think Black Lives Matter came into being with George Floyd, dying under the knee of that policeman in Minneapolis. And that's just not true. Obviously, they were there right after Trayvon Martin's murder was acquitted in Florida. And what's interesting here, Tom, is that the women who create Black Lives Matter are not in Florida. They're in California, in Oakland. And what you see is Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, Opal Tometi are online. Again, the new platform for the second movement. They're online and discussing how people are saying, oh, well, he was wearing a hoodie, he's out in the rain, he's talking to his girlfriend. And they're like, and the response from these women and people who are following them is, wait a minute, that's a 17-year-old coming home with some candy and a drink. What is going on here? Black Lives Matter. I don't care how he was dressed. I don't care if he had his pants hanging out. He's a young man and his life mattered. Black Lives Matter. That's the start. So you're going back here early in the first Obama term. I think Martin is killed in 12. The verdict comes in 13. So that's when Black Lives Matter starts. But then, of course, it continues to grow, Tom, because you have, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, 2016, Eric Garner, Alton Sterling, famously in 14, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And I mentioned that one at the very start of the book because this fits with our earlier conversation about Obama. The question is, okay, you've got a black president and you've got race riots taking place in middle America. Is the first black president going to go? What could he do? What can he say? Maybe he can say something that will resolve this situation in a way that none of his predecessors, all white, could have done. Well, ultimately, he doesn't go. But in terms of the story of Black Lives Matter, some of the ladies that I mentioned to you actually go to Ferguson to try to help in that situation. And the question afterwards is, are we now seeing the emergence of an organized, centralized Black Lives Matter movement? And that's when they defer. They say, no, each community can have its own chapter of Black Lives Matter. They can make their own decisions about their agenda. And what happens, unfortunately, in some cases is there's a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability with regard to finances, huge amounts of money pouring after the George Floyd murder, tens of millions of dollars, questions about how it's used, how it's spent. But I would just throw in here, for all of the attacks then that allows to take place on their legitimacy and on their agenda and their sincere passion, it's still the case that when the George Floyd Black Lives Matter marches take place, most of the people marching are white. Most of the money's coming from white America. Trump and the others are trying to say, oh, these people are thugs, they're violent, they're threatening. Well, later we can see from statistical analysis that's just not true, that 90+% of these marches were peaceful. But again, Black Lives Matter remains to this day it's not as popular as it once was. Once it was like two-thirds of Americans, thought the world of Black Lives Matter and the idea of doing something about social justice and racial justice in America and asking questions about how we can deal with this. But even with Trump coming in, belittling Black Lives Matter, caricaturing them in negative ways, arguing about uh, Black history, what is allowed to be taught to our children, including white children. Trump seems to be arguing you don't want to make those children feel guilty or bad about themselves because of what happened in the past. Even with all that, Black Lives Matter still has more than 50% approval in this country. And I think lots of people lose touch with that.
Thanks for that, Juan. And Jamelle, I don't know if you have any reflections on Black Lives Matter, again, sort of as an organization, a movement, and or hashtag as part of this second civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, the uh, Black Lives Matter is it's interesting to think about both as let me rewind. I think that when you look at Black Lives Matter in the years since Ferguson, for example, because that's when I would like pinpoint it. Like that's when it kind of really does emerge as a thing. To Juan's point about the positive view that Americans have of Black Lives Matter, even still, I think it points to sort of the real success of the movement. The fact that um it did produce like a measurable change in attitudes. It did produce some kind of policy gains in some places. Again, not in a sort of top-down way, but in plenty of cities and localities, progressive prosecutors are elected. There are attempts to sort of do some serious criminal justice reform. At the very least, under Biden, the Justice Department was, still doing these pattern and practice investigations of police departments accused of discrimination. So there's that sort of thing, but the extent to which it did create this greater awareness of of the legacy of racism in the United States, the extent to which it did, I think, and I think Juan is absolutely right about this, the extent to which it uh inculcated in young white people a broader commitment to racial justice, such that many of those protests in 2020 were it was just white people. I remember reading there's a story in the Washington Post, I think, about a George Floyd protest on the Eastern Shore of Virginia that was just sort of like a bunch of white teenagers, and there were no black people there. I mean, there were hardly any black people in the area, and yet a bunch of white 15-year-olds were like, I feel strongly enough about this to want to organize a protest, and that represents like a real and powerful cultural victory, cultural shift that I think Black Lives Matter um, is responsible for the larger movement, which again, because it's so horizontal and diffuse, it's like hard to say that there are like leaders in the traditional sense, but this sort of this cultural movement, I think, was quite powerful and quite successful. And I will note that right now there is this crusade against DEI. But even now, when you poll Americans, majorities say that they agree with DEI, right? Sort of, I think part of maybe the ferocity of the reaction is a recognition that um, most people think diversity is good. Most people, like when you tell them, there are these legacies of racism that still affect how people's lives turn out, they say, "Oh, we should do something about that," right? Like
Yeah.
most people are actually like pretty fair-minded about these things, and it does take like real effort to sort of push against them, which is what I think we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I think there's an effort to demonize people who, to your point, I think it's just common sense. Look at the history of our country going back to original sin, slavery. But you stop and think about Trump. He goes after the New York Times for that famous, is it 1619 project?
Mhm.
Right.
Right. Uh, I mean, to this day, the whole idea that you would think about race and history, he finds it offensive. It's like, well, I don't not, I'm not going to get, I don't want it to be political, but I'm just telling, I mean, it's common sense to me that most Americans think, yeah, we should be honest about this conversation about the impact that race has had on American society. You hear people talk about identity, especially people on the right, the Trumpians, identity politics. And you think, where have I encountered identity politics in America before? Oh, maybe it was preference and advantage for white men. Uh, but that's not the way some people want to talk.
Yeah, and I mean, Jamelle did I think a nice job of framing, sort of some of the cultural influence that the Black Lives Matter movement has had on America. I mean, when we're thinking as we wrap up here, Juan, we're getting to our last 10 minutes, and we want to think about the second civil rights movement's overall legacy. I mean, Jamelle gave us some good ways to think about it. How would you frame some of the achievements of the second civil rights movement? And what would you term, some of the shortfalls, some of the work that certainly is left undone?
I mean,
Well,
oh,
yeah,
is
go
this?
ahead.
I think it's achievement wise. Again, there's this cultural victory. There are these, policy things happening, especially when it comes to uh, uh, law enforcement and police reform, and so on and so forth. I think that I honestly think we still may be, and this goes to Juan's point that this is an ongoing thing. I think we still may be witnessing like what the ultimate policy implication of this will be long term. Like what kind of um political pushes we'll see as a result of 2014 to the present, because so many of the people who got mobilized in 2020, for example, are still around, right? Like they may be running for office in the next 5 or 10 years. They may be trying to get involved in a more formal way in the near future. And so I think it remains to be seen what the ultimate kind of like policy impact of all this is going to be.
Thank you for that, Jamelle. Same question to you, Juan. Just thinking about achievements and possible shortfalls of the second civil rights movement.
Well, I think that the political discussion has shifted in a very important way to address something like police brutality. I mean, you think back, go way, I don't think it's way back. I'm not, the start of our conversation, we were arguing about what's first movement, but you go back to Rodney King, remember him?
Mhm.
And that's 1990s. And the policeman who abused him, when he famously says, "Can't we all get along?" They're found not guilty, despite videotape evidence. And they are found not guilty by a jury that's told there's a thin blue line that protects all of us and the civilization. But when it comes, uh, to 2020, you see white America picking up on what Jamel was just talking about, saying, "Hey, wait a second, this is not right. That you can't do that." And especially young white people respond in a way that I think is a little different. And so you can see, I think Black Lives Matter had an impact there. And I think Black Lives Matter has also had an impact. We think about police reform as part of that. Now, it couldn't quite get through the Senate, real police reform, but you've seen it on local levels and in state governments, efforts to try to rein in the idea that anything the police do is to be allowed to protect, the thin blue line or whatever it is, right? The second thing I would say about this is when we think about hiring, when we think about school admissions, when you think about cultural representation as well as curriculum, on all these levels, Black Lives Matter has made a difference. And part of the political discussion would be about voter suppression. The Voting Rights Act has not been renewed in full by this Congress, again, Republican opposition and the like. But you've seen the emergence of people like Stacey Abrams, who fought against voter suppression in Georgia, and it led to the election of a Black and Jewish U.S. Senator from the state of Georgia. That's pretty good. And you think about President Biden coming in, and he tried his best on police reform. He said he tried in terms of dealing with income inequality, things like helping young people, disproportionately minority kids, with high levels of debt from school tuition and the like. And of course, you also have Ketanji Brown Jackson on the U.S. Supreme Court, a nominee by President Biden and approved by the Senate. To me, these are landmarks. I think they are points of progress. And the larger cultural conversation, progress. I think we have a larger black middle class in the country, progress. But it's an ongoing struggle. And if you ask me, Tom, about areas that I think could be improved for a third civil rights movement, it would be that maybe some of the Black Lives Matter people who felt, and I'm not talking to these politicians. Politics is a bunch of junk, and they're very cynical, disinterested. They think it's not hip, not cool to say, we got to win elections. Maybe now in the second term of Trump, they think, you know what, we should win elections. Got to fight that fight and get involved and talk to politicians. And if it's necessary to make compromises, well, maybe you gain 5 yards today, 10 yards tomorrow. You don't score a touchdown every time.
Thanks for that, Juan. And Jamelle, Juan brings up the image or the thinking ahead to a third civil rights movement. If you were to, what lessons would you hope that a third civil rights movement would draw from both the first and second civil rights movement that we've talked about today?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of lessons to draw, from the first civil rights movement, it is that like actual state power is important. Like being able to um, put pressure on the federal government to act is important. I think any the substantive goals of a third civil rights movement, it's going to have to be like reinvigorating the civil rights laws of the '60s, reinvigorating the Reconstruction Amendment, which in their own way are like civil rights laws, right? Like reinvigorating the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, especially. But then from the second civil rights movement, recognizing the power of sort of a horizontal organization and recognizing the power of, broad cultural change. I think you kind of have to merge the two, the, um, merge the focus of the first civil rights movement with like the broadness of the second to produce something new. But in any case, I think there's a real substantive agenda on the table, and you can kind of work backwards from, court rulings, gutting the Voting Rights Act. You can work backwards from efforts to like weaponize civil rights laws against efforts to cultivate diversity. There's a substantive agenda, and so I would hope that if there's anything like a third movement, it will focus on trying to reinvigorate federal power to protect people's voting rights, to protect people's civil rights, to try once again to put the country on the path towards something more egalitarian.
And last question to you, Juan, just filling anything else from if we have a third civil rights movement, any other lessons you'd hope that it would draw from the first and the second?
Well, I think the country is changing even as we speak, but the big change to me has been the demographic shifts. That when we talk about race, I just think it's important to note, that people predict this is going to be a non-white majority country sometime after 2050 or so. I don't know, I have the exact date in mind. And, one of the realities that I'm coming into as I discuss the topic of this, new prize for these eyes, a second civil rights movement with people, is that they understand that you've got to deal with race. You got to talk about race. There's no like pretending, oh, you can just ignore the whole Black Lives Matter movement or demonize it or say, no, we need to talk about race because America is already a big melting pot and it's going to be more racially diverse in the future. And to have this nostalgia about white dominance as the whole story, and we're trying to restore white dominance, it's, to me, I think more people, even people on the right, understand there's a need to have this conversation because you can't stop the change taking place in America's racial composition.
Well, we will end it there. Juan Williams, Jamelle Bouie, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation about the second civil rights movement.